We're ready? Okay, good morning. Today we are dealing with the topic of transgenderism. We'll spend 2 weeks on this, one today and one next week. Today deals with the biblical argument, which we're doing this in the same way that we dealt with the issue of homosexuality, in that we'll present the biblical argument the first week. That is the conversation to have, just kind of a preview really, because we can't get crazy in depth, but preview of the conversation that you would have with somebody who is self-identifying as both a Christian and as homosexual. And today, and then the second week of this, we dealt with those that aren't, that are self-identifying as homosexual but not self-identifying as Christian. Okay, so we're doing the same thing with transsexuality. Today is the biblical argument, so what you would say to a person who was self-identifying as both Christian and either gender dysphoric or transsexual. And then next week we will look at the cultural argument, those that are self-identifying as gender dysphoric, transsexual, but not self-identifying as Christian. So before we start, 2 terms to define. Gender dysphoric would refer to people who feel like their birth sex is incongruent with how they feel about their gender, right? So somebody who's gender dysphoric would say something like, I feel like I am a woman trapped in a man's body. That would be gender dysphoric. There feels like an incongruence between how you are in your mind and how you are physically. The other is transsexual, which refers to those that have, folks that have started to make the transition from one gender to another, either by just expression, as in cross-dressing or something of that nature, or by way of hormone therapy, or by way of sexual reassignment surgery. Okay, so these are huge umbrella terms. We're going to speak about them at the 5,000-foot view, right? Because one is we don't have the time to speak about each individual situation, and 2, I'm not qualified to do that because a lot of it gets into really significant psychology and medicine and stuff like that. I'm just trying to give you the theology of the situation. So we pulled the first week that we looked at homosexuality, we pulled from a Church of Christ who was gay affirming and, well, they were LGBTQ affirming, all of them. We pulled from a document that they produced to defend their position, and I said I would do the same thing today for transsexuality as well. So I'm pulling from this Church of Christ that is LGBT affirming so that we have something to respond to, something to aim our arguments at. These, just like with the issue of homosexuality, these are fairly typical Christian arguments for folks that self-identify as Christian and are LGBTQ affirming. This is fairly typical. And so here are those. He says, the goodness and beauty of the creation of which humans are a part is found not only in its contrasting binary categories such as day and night, land and water, but also in the in-betweenness among those categories, such as dawn and dusk, wetlands and ice shelves. Similarly, the goodness and beauty of humans is found not only in the contrasting binary categories such as male and female and the relationship between males and females, but also in the in-betweenness of those categories and the relationship between individuals among them. All creation, including humanity, expresses and experiences a goodness and beauty in between and beyond any binary categories. Okay? So what they are defending is that just as in Genesis 1 and 2, God creates order among the cosmos and makes distinctions between day and night and land and sea and these kinds of things. Well, there are also, you can look at the created order and see that there are places where those things kind of mix, right? Swamps and ice shelves are. They're kind of this and kind of that, right? And there is beauty in those places, is the argument that they're making. And so it logically follows, according to this way of thinking, it follows that why can't the same thing be true of gender, right? That's the argument. We're going to respond to it in a minute. Amy Peeler, a scholar that deals in this area, the writer of this says, Amy Peeler wrestles with the gender identity. I meant to take this one out and I forgot because it's, well, you'll see. I've showed it to you, so I'm going to read it. But Amy Peeler wrestles with the gender identity of Jesus, concluding he is a male-embodied Savior with a female-provided flesh. And that, to quote scholar Anthony Lincoln, if Jesus had human flesh, and the texts of the New Testament are rather adamant that he did, and that's true, the text of the New Testament is adamant that Jesus was human, truly human, that human flesh came from her, right? Mary supplies what the woman normally supplies in procreation, her genes, her body, her food, her energy, her blood. God's Holy Spirit overshadowed her flesh so that it could do what it could not do on its own, namely conceive a child. To send the Savior, the Spirit came upon only one human, and that human was a woman. In other words, the flesh of Jesus is both male and female. And how is that different from, I'm not even really sure what to do with it. How is that different from, like, every male is born of woman, right? So that doesn't give a uniquely potent argument, I don't think, because it's not any different than, we're all born a woman, right? So anyway. Next, gender is in many respects performed. Now we see this in our culture like crazy. This belief is definitely in our culture. Gender is in many respects performed, that it's not a concrete thing, but it's a performance that is performed in ways that are shaped by culture. And this performance, however, may vary from what we might otherwise call gender identity, or even sex, which is biologically based. So how you act out your gender can be unique from how you were born, right? That's the idea. The performance of your gender can be different than the reality of your biological sex. Then one more. How we envision God is of vital importance regarding the church and the LGBTQ community, because, as Amy Peeler writes, it is easier to devalue and then mistreat those humans who are believed to be less like God. And just to stop, if I find a Christian who believes that somebody that belongs to is identifying as LGBTQ, if I find a Christian who believes that the person who identifies as LGBTQ, I've got a harsh word for that Christian. That if they believe that that person is less in the image of God than anybody else, right? They are just as, that's the trouble I have with this one is, what is it about your sin situation that makes you less in the image of God? Right? As you are, nothing. Everybody is created with equal dignity and worth as somebody made in the image of God. And so there tends to be going on. There has been a tendency to somehow believe that sexuality and gender that does not conform to clear binary categories results from humans who are less like God. And I don't know of anybody making such an argument, but it's a terrible argument from the Christian side of things if somebody is.
It's a victim mentality. It's creating people who are victims, so therefore they can have people lift them up, and that's kind of a wide swath.
Yeah, yes, right. It is, if you can identify as a victim, then you have a greater foothold in our culture, right? So those are some of the things that we'll be kind of responding to today. We get at least 4 questions that result from these. 1, biblically, is there an in-betweenness when it comes to gender? Is there in-betweenness when it comes to gender? 2, what was Jesus' relationship to his own gender? Like I said, I meant to take that one out, but Jesus was born a male. He lived as a male. He embodied maleness. We'll say why that is whenever we get to gender roles here in a little bit. That he was raised, his resurrected body was male. That his glorified body did not shirk gender. It looks like there's gender even in the afterlife. He embodies it from resurrection. Is gender and even sex only a culturally constructed thing? Is it a performance? Or is there something more concrete there? And fourthly, we want to ask, well, we've already answered this. Do transgender people have the same dignity and worth as non-transgender people? Yes. As Christians, we believe that because they're created in the image of a holy God. So I wanted to I really am giving more time to the first and third questions rather than the second and fourth, but we'll get into those. Any comments, questions, thoughts before we go on?
When I read that first question, I don't think there's an in-between when it comes to gender. It's behavior. Because male and female, they're comparing to other things that are not other male and female species, but we don't find, or at least I've never read anything where there's any evidence that, cows have an LGBTQ community, right? Like, male cows aren't attracted to other male cows.
So
at least nothing I've ever read has said that. So it's our humanness and the behavior. The behavior may be in between.
Yeah.
Right, but because of our humanness.
Yeah. Is there?
Doesn't have anything to do with our gender.
Yeah. So the question is there an in-between in gender, or is it just in behavior, right? Well, once you say that gender is performed, then you can blur into some in-betweenness in gender. But I think that's right, that there is in-betweenness in behavior, but there's not in biological sex, right? And I think there's another way to understand this that we're actually going to get into right here. So let's just, yeah, go ahead.
Can you describe the difference between gender and sex? If we start using the word gender, some people use it interchangeably.
Yeah.
There is a difference. Can you?
Yeah, the difference question is describing the difference in gender and sex. And best I understand it, which may not be, definitions seem to be more elusive every day. But that sex is more of a biological reality, and gender is how it's lived out, right? To give it a thumbnail sketch. I remember as a kid preferring, and I think maybe at one point these were synonymous, maybe. I remember as a kid preferring to say gender because I didn't want to say sex, right? And now people, but those have kind of moved further away from each other to where gender is viewed as more of a performance, and sex is viewed more as the biological, how you were born, right? I almost said your sex assigned at birth, but that's really a different. Yeah.
In the medical field, I'm fortunate that I don't have to do it when I'm setting up a patient on the phone. But if I was face to face at a clinic, one of the questions I would say, what was your sex at birth?
Yeah. We're making a distinction now on having to ask what your sex was at birth. Now, because I'm going to believe that it's fluid. Let's get through. I want to answer this in between this question. I think it's an interesting one, and I think it's one that the Christian worldview has a way to answer that it actually is very good. Genesis 26 through 28. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. And God blessed them, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And so God creates male, and he creates female, and he tells them right off the bat to be fruitful and multiply. That God has this creative act to make male and make female, which we'll revisit over and over again. And then immediately after God creates male and female, he tells them to continue the creative act, right? Be fruitful and multiply. And we can only participate in this creative act, which God has commanded us to participate in. We can only participate in the creative act that creates more image-bearing beings by joining together as male and female, right? So the man and the woman become one flesh, and this continues the creative process that God started, right? The only way, this is cool, the only way God creates a thing in his image, and the only way to create more things in the image of God is for man and woman to come together, right? We are the process through which more image-bearing beings come into being. Like, that's neat, right? And I think this is the unique in-betweenness. The beauty of the in-betweenness is not in movement between male and female, but it is in male and female becoming one. It is in two becoming one and producing something out of that. Because we talk about like ice shelves and swamps, wetlands or whatever, we're not actually talking about in-betweenness, we're talking about combinations, right? And whenever we combine that two good things that God creates, something beautiful happens in that spot, right? And so it's not actually a in-betweenness, but it is a combining of things, that man and woman form one flesh, and we continue God's creative process that he started. I think it's a misunderstanding of the beauty of in-betweenness, or the beauty of combined things. Man can create things by himself. Woman can create things by herself. A group of men can create things by themselves. Yesterday, a group of men created a mess out here in the yard. A group of women can create things by themselves, but it's only in the combination of one man, one woman that we can create things that are in the image of God. Right. There's just a biological reality that we can We can muddy this however we choose to, but the fact is that it takes one male and one female to create another image bearer of God. And you can distort that however you want to and act like it's not true, but it is simply the reality of things. Now, some people might argue that marriage is an ice shelf or a swamp, but that would be a different, just a joke. Okay. To be clear. So that, I think there's a misunderstanding there about where the beauty of in-betweenness is, where the beauty of the combination is. Secondly, we wanted to look at, is gender and sex a culturally constructed performance? Now, this is something where there's a grain of truth, and that's why it can go so far, right? Now, is there a sense in which gender is culturally constructed? Well, of course. There are all sorts of things in our culture that we say are common to men that aren't actually common to men, and all sorts of things that we say are common to women that aren't actually all common to women. Okay, so example is, I hate to mow. I absolutely hate it. There is nothing more meaningless that I can think of than to mow this week and to next week to do it again. Like, that stuff just keeps growing. I hate it. Always have. Ashley does the lion's share of the mowing at our house. That is a culturally constructed thing, right? There's not a problem there. Ashley will break out in a cold sweat if she walks in our kitchen, but I like to cook, right? I enjoy cooking. Those are culturally constructed gender stereotypes. That's not what we're talking about here. I remember when Ashley and I were in our premarital counseling. We had taken a survey. Our premarital counselor was great, but he had us take an inventory on, ask all sorts of questions about your hopes and dreams and background and stuff like this, families of origin and stuff like that. And there were two categories where Ashley and I scored like opposite of each other. And one of them was closeness to our family of origin, right? She's very close to hers. I'm not close to mine. And the other was on gender roles. And so what he did was he looked at all these categories, and on the spots where we were opposite, that's where you're most likely to have trouble, right? And so you need to talk about those things before you get neck deep into this. And so he said, okay, so on family of origin, like, there was some stuff to work through there. On gender role, we looked at it and went, what's the problem? It just wasn't a thing, even though it was relatively unusual relative to other couples. And really, role has not been a tension point. So there are all sorts of ways that this is culturally constructed. But the Bible does say that and women are different, right? And that we have different roles. We are equal in dignity and worth, but different in roles. And we have trouble in our culture thinking that difference of roles means difference of worth. And that's where a lot of this, I think, comes from. God created a male-female order and distinction, and he commands us to uphold it. And I want you to consider a few places in Scripture where we learn this to be the case. Romans 5:12, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. For indeed sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. Now, you remember Genesis 1, 2, 3? Why does Paul forget it? Why does Paul say then that sin came into the world through one man? It's a real question. Because did it?
Well, woman was created from man, and they both sinned. You know, Eve may have been the one that was first deceived, but they both sinned. But ultimately, Eve also came from Adam.
So, because Eve comes from Adam, it's guilt by association, right? Kind of a thing, to some extent. But also, if you carry on, or you revisit this, Genesis 3:6. So when the tree was good for food, light to the eyes, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. But sin comes through one man. I remember a preacher one time going through this story, and he summarized it for us, and he says that Eve takes the fruit and she thinks about it a while, and she finally convinces herself to eat of it, and then maybe she takes it home, she sticks it under her pillow, and she slowly convinces, he was there, like he was there. I think what Paul is trying to communicate is Adam's sin is in saying no, or not saying. Adam's sin, the first sin was not the eating of the apple, or the eating of the fruit. I'm still on my beginner's Bible. It's always an apple in there. The first sin is not the eating of the fruit. The first sin is Adam not protecting his bride, right? This is how sin comes into the world through one man. 1 Corinthians 16 would tell us something about what this is supposed to look like. He tells the men to be watchful, to stand firm, to act like men. This is what it is to act like men, to be watchful, to stand firm, to be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. Adam shirked on all of these things. He wasn't watchful. He wasn't standing firm. He wasn't acting in love. Okay, and carrying on. We have all sorts of issues with this passage, right? I even remember I was going to read this. We have a question? Somebody have a question? Yes.
I just was going to comment that it looks like it was that God gave the commandment to not eat that tree just to Adam before Eve.
Yeah.
The commandment was given to Adam.
Yeah, the commandment given to Adam, right?
Assuming that he was just supposed to pass it on.
Yeah, assuming that it was supposed to pass it on to her, but whether or not Eve knew or did not know, what we do know is that Adam had the responsibility, right? Because he was the one that was told. Yes, so very good. So I remember doing a wedding one time where the bride told me not to read this. We have all sorts of issues with it, but anyway, Ephesians 5:22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church's body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. And how do we know that this, I think the point is, right, and throughout Scripture we can see the husband-wife relationship being the model for God's relationship with his people. That necessitates a distinct woman and a distinct man in order for that to work. But the wife's holiness should be the husband's priority. And this fact is rooted in the created order, and that much is not culturally bound. There are all sorts of things related to gender that I don't care, right? It doesn't matter if we move those things. It doesn't matter. This one matters, that the wife's holiness is the man's responsibility to a large degree, right? She's accountable on her own, but men are as well. Husbands, love your wives as Christ. And this is why the first part that we just read is such a problem, because we stop, right? And we don't read the rest. But the rest says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify her. So you have this is explicit language. Christ sanctified the church. Husbands, treat your wife like Christ treated the church, right? So to sanctify her, cleansing her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor. The husband's role is to present his wife to the Lord and say, look, right? Without spot, wrinkle, or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands, in the same way, all those things that he just said that Christ did to the church, husbands, in the same way, this is how your relationship ought to look, right? It's incredible. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. For whoever hated his own flesh but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. This is all. You could substitute Christ and the church with husband and wife throughout this, and vice versa. And it still be just as true, because we are all members of his body. Therefore, a man, this is how we know it's not a cultural command, that none of this is cultural. He ties it back to the created order. Therefore, a man should leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Now, how difficult is mutual submission with one another in a relationship that looks like this, right? Now, we don't have time to do it here, but we could, the problem with the word submission is that there's a problem with the word love, right? On the other side of it. And if love looks like it's supposed to, then how much different does the word submission, is that changed for us? Is that softened for us? There are all sorts of ways we can point to that women and men are different, but the one that matters is in holiness. Now, you know this, for anything to run correctly. So the husband-wife relationship is there for the purpose of holiness and mission. We'll talk about mission the last week that we're together with this. But for anything to run correctly, you know that the organizational structure of a thing, whether it's an organization, a company, a relationship, or a widget, it's got to be put together right? The organizational structure of a thing must be clear, and we must be dedicated to operating the thing within its design specifications, right? That's all we have here, right? We have an organizational structure for the purpose of holiness and mission, and if we operate it correctly, it will work well, and if we don't, we're in for a world of pain for us and those around us and beyond. And so within the marriage relationship, the husband's role is to pay attention to when Satan is targeting our wives and children. And it is within the context it's in the context of watchful, submission happens within the context of watchful, cherishing love, right? And it's whenever we refer to submission outside the context of watchful, cherishing love that you've got all those issues about the word submission that you bristle on. And I get that. The submission, what's the word? The submission, it is assumes watchful, cherishing love, right? I think that the major issue in the church is not homosexuality. Major issue in the church is not transgenderism. It's not even women's role, which get a lot of airtime. Those three get a lot of airtime. The trouble in the church is men's role. Men's perennial vices are passivity or aggression, right? And when led one way or the other, we see a disruption of the organizational structure of the way marriage is supposed to run. And we get all sorts of issues that flow downstream from there. You could trace a lot of these issues that we're talking about and bring in also the issue that we like to adjust according to the culture of women's role, as what we call it, which is always said in what they can't do rather than what they can, in my experience, which I think that there's a dereliction of duty there as well. But if we would, instead of dealing with those, if we would deal with men's role, then a lot of these issues downstream would not exist. Okay, thoughts, comments, questions?
Corey, I have a question. So I know it's rare, but what about the instances where a child is born both male and female?
Yeah.
And then the parents have to decide which gender to go with. Like,
Okay.
is that just part of just like sin, nature,
Yeah.
messing up?
So,
What is that?
yeah. So the question's about what's called intersex issues. If a child is born with we're getting into medical stuff, and I'm not a medical person, but there are cases, rare cases, where a child is born where the genitalia doesn't match the biology or something of this nature, okay? I'm not going to say a lot because I'll say something wrong pretty quick. But if something like this happens, there are hiccups in creation all over the place, right? As a result of Genesis 3. All creation groans to be redeemed, right? As Romans 8-ish. Creation is, so Adam and Eve sin and the ground becomes hard and childbearing becomes painful, right? So we know that our sin affects creation itself. It affected the ground, which had nothing to do with the sin, right? And so that, I think, that is why that does happen. We have hiccups in God's good created order because everything was affected by Adam and Eve's sin. That's why that happens. What do you do with it? That is another question that is very difficult, and I don't know exactly. But I would, my mostly uneducated thought on it is that you would consider the biology of the child, and that you would do what you needed to do surgically to get that to match, and raise them according to their biological sex, is what I would say, if they're presenting as something other than that. Yeah. Yes.
I watched a video one time, and it was regarding people that were intersex, and it was from a renowned evolutionary biologist, and she agreed that people should be able to express themselves transsexually however they wanted to express themselves, but she said that regardless of the situation, that every human being, as an evolutionary biologist, was either male or female.
Yeah, everybody from a biological point of view is male or female, and I think we should make our medical decisions based on that, and how we will raise that child based on that biological reality. Yeah, I agree. Very good. So I hesitate to do this. Oh, I got to go quick. I'm going to bring up an Old Testament passage, and I said that I wasn't going to do that whenever we dealt with homosexuality. But I'm going to bring up an Old Testament passage, and I want to preface it with this, that one of the most useful tools for biblical interpretation that I've ever encountered is to be able to ask the question. You can read any piece of scripture, whether it's a story, a law, a direct command, whatever it is, and say, okay, given this, what is the principle that lies behind that law, that story, that command, or whatever? And because that will help you determine if the Old Testament law, either the Old Testament law carries over, if you can distill it down to its principle, or if it is a cultural command as well, right? So I'll give you an example here. So if you can ask the principle, you can follow the principle, and that's going to be biblically helpful, right? So one example, do not commit adultery. It's an Old Testament law, right? Don't commit adultery. What's the principle behind it? The principle is to be faithful to your spouse, right? Principle is to be faithful to your spouse. So you can ask, okay, so is that cultural or what? Well, the principle is be faithful to your spouse. So is there ever an instance in which you can cheat on your spouse and still remain faithful to your spouse, right? Is there any application of the principle that works where you don't have to follow the direct law of don't commit adultery? No, there's not, right? Being faithful in and of itself means not cheating on your spouse, right? Okay, so there's another one. Greet one another with a holy kiss, right? This is a direct command that appears in the New Testament, not the Old, a direct command that appears in the New Testament 6 times. I think it's 6. I mean, it's a lot. Like, we're told to kiss each other 6 times, and yet nobody's ever kissed me, and don't start. But we have to ask the question then, okay, so why do we, and we're like direct command people, right? If the Bible has a direct command for us, why in the world do we not, why do we not follow this one? Like, we're Bible-believing people. 6 times we're told to greet each other with a holy kiss, and we're like, well, whatever. Is that okay? Well, what's the principle? To treat Christians with hospitality, right? To greet one another in a hospitable, loving way. Well, can you do that without kissing somebody? Of course, right? In fact, it's easier in our culture to do that without kissing them. So, of course, it's cultural. So, with that idea, what is the principle behind this law that we see in Deuteronomy 22:3, that a woman shouldn't wear a man's garment and a man shouldn't wear a woman's garment, right? What's the principle behind this? Well, I think that it seems, and given context, and write it down and go back and look, but given context, God, in a slew of those laws given there, is telling them to operate according to design specifications, right? And so if you are a woman, present as a woman. If you are a man, present as a man. It seems that that is what the Lord is telling them. It's also connected, we won't read it. Y'all have done this on Wednesday night, I know, in the auditorium class. 1 Corinthians 11, the deal of head coverings and length of hair related to men and women. And specifically in worship, whenever you pray. What's the principle behind the head coverings in this discussion? That is to come to God in a worthy manner. Come to God in a worthy manner. How do you do that? Well, one of the ways that you come to God in a worthy manner is that you honor the created order. If you are a man, you come to God as a man. If you're a woman, you come to God as a woman. And some of what that means, coming to God as a man or as a woman, some of what that means is a culturally constructed thing. Which is why we don't do head coverings anymore, and why we don't care about length of hair, right? Because some of it's culturally constructed. But the male-female binary is not constructed. It's reality. It's part of created order that's rooted in God's creative actions. So here we ask, what is the principle? And some of it is universal, universally applied. Present as a man, present as a woman, but some of it's cultural. Head coverings don't matter, and length of hair is not a concern to us. Okay, I want to do this very, very fast. So when God created Adam, he did so out of the dust of the ground. And when he created Eve, he took one of the ribs out of Adam's side to make to make Eve. Now, the word rib here is in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Old Testament, the word rib appears 41 times. Out of 41 times, 2 times it comes up in this story, referring to Adam's rib given to Eve. And 1 time it comes up in Daniel 7, where there's a beast and he's got ribs in his mouth. Discard that one. I don't know what's going on there. That's for a class on Daniel. But in 41 times, there are 3 exceptions to this rule. And here's the rule. Every time the Bible refers, the Hebrew Old Testament refers to ribs, it refers to a part of the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, the temple, or some sort of furnishing within the tabernacle or temple, like the lampstand or something of that nature. Every time this word comes up, aside from those 3, it refers to something within the tabernacle, temple, or something, the Ark of the Covenant, something like that. Now, think of all the theological importance of the tabernacle and temple. This is where God dwells. This is where God dwells. So you can see what is going on. God builds man from the dirt. God literally does the dirt work. He lays the foundation, and he builds the walls of the temple, of the tabernacle, of the place he's going to live within, out of the man. Adam is the foundation, Eve is the temple. In a kind of a literal way. I mean, that's pretty clear. 41 or 40 instances, 40 out of 40 instances, this is where we're going with this. And then he says it is from here, this foundation of Adam, these walls of Eve, it is from this union that every image-bearing, God image-bearing thing on earth is going to come. Someone say, cool? Like, are you kidding me? That's incredible. And it necessitates man and it necessitates woman, right? Gender dysphoria is not a feature of creation. It is a result of the curse that blurs the created order. And gender is not solely a culturally created performance, but it is a biblically bestowed obligation to us. Our roles are literally engendered to us. See what I did there? Okay. That when it's done well, it produces goodness and holiness and pleasure and image bearers of the creator of the universe. And this is why we respect our maleness and our femaleness. Yeah, you better be quick.
It's quick. I think it ties back to what you're talking about with where like women's role gets a lot of airtime, and sexuality and all that. But it really all goes back to the foundation, like you're saying, it goes back to the man. And so when you walk up and you see a beautiful building, you don't say, look at this lovely foundation.
Right.
This building, either the building is correct or the building is beautiful.
Yeah.
It's the sturdiness of it, its actual main quality is in its foundation. And so it goes back to the main.
And you don't ever find a building with a junky foundation that is beautiful because it's all wonky, right? As a result.
You could make synonymous, I mean, with like leading. Like I have no trouble following someone who leads me well.
Right.
If the man
Yeah.
leads well, it's not that the woman submits and has nothing. The woman is a pleasure to follow.
Right.
You are loved and taken
We've all been led well and we've all been led poorly. And what does submission look like when you're led well versus when you're led poorly, right?
when she takes a role that's not meant for her.
Right. Okay, very good. The end. Goodbye.